Picture this. It's 1840. You're standing on a ridge somewhere in what we now call South Dakota, and stretching out before you, as far as your eyes can see, is an ocean of grass. Not the tame, fenced pastures we know today, but an endless prairie that rolls like green waves all the way to the horizon. And moving across this grassland like schools of fish through water are the buffalo. Millions of them. So many that when a herd passes, the ground shakes for miles, and the thunder of hooves drowns out human voices. But here's what would really capture your attention: the horsemen following those herds. The Lakota, 25,000 strong at the peak of their power, controlling territory that stretched from the Missouri River all the way to the Bighorn Mountains. These weren't just any horsemen. These were perhaps the finest light cavalry the world had ever seen. And they were living through what we might call their golden age, that brief, shining moment before everything changed forever. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if these history tales fascinate you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Now, to understand what made this moment so remarkable, we need to go back to the beginning. The Lakota hadn't always been horsemen. For thousands of years, they were foot-walking people, part of the great confederation known as the Oseti-Sakowin, the Seven Council Fires. Each spring, these 7 bands would scatter across the northern plains, following game trails their ancestors had walked since before memory became history. They lived in harmony with the rhythm of the seasons, moving their camps as naturally as rivers flow to the sea. But around 1700, something extraordinary happened. Horses began appearing on the northern plains. Not all at once. A few here, a few there, traded up from Spanish settlements far to the south or captured in raids. The Lakota called them sacred dogs because they seemed like dogs grown impossibly large and swift. Within just a few generations, these walking people had transformed themselves into a nation of horsemen so skilled that other tribes hired them as mercenaries. Think about that transformation for a moment. In human terms, we're talking about the span of a single lifetime. Imagine if your grandfather remembered when the fastest anyone could travel was at a walking pace, maybe 20 miles in a good day. But by the time his grandson was hunting buffalo, that same journey could be covered in 2 hours. The horse didn't just change how the Lakota moved. It changed everything about how they lived, fought, and saw themselves. Young men who would become legends were learning their craft during these years. Sitting Bull, born around 1831, was crawling around buffalo hide tipis before he could properly walk, watching his father prepare for hunts that would take the men away for weeks. Crazy Horse, whose light-colored hair and pale skin marked him as touched by spirits even as a child, was practicing the art of counting coup, striking enemies without killing them, the ultimate demonstration of bravery. And Gaul, who would grow into one of the most feared war leaders on the plains, was learning that in Lakota society, generosity mattered more than wealth, and courage more than cleverness. But it wasn't just the men. Women like Pretty Shield were mastering arts that would make their families wealthy by any standard of the time. The work they did with buffalo hides, the intricate beadwork, the perfectly fitted clothing, the waterproof containers, created trade goods so valuable that a single decorated robe might be worth 20 horses. These women maintained the camps, raised the children, and preserved the knowledge that held Lakota society together. At the center of it all were the Black Hills, Pahasapa in their language. These weren't just mountains to the Lakota. They were the sacred heart of their world, the place where young men went to seek visions and holy men communed with spirits. The hills provided everything a people could need: water, game, shelter from winter storms, and the spiritual connection that made them who they were. Here's what gets me about this period. The Lakota were living at the exact peak of what their way of life could achieve. They had the mobility that horses provided, but they hadn't yet encountered the diseases and disruptions that European contact would bring. They controlled vast territories, but weren't locked into the kind of static borders that would later be drawn on maps. They were wealthy in every way that mattered to them, rich in horses, rich in buffalo, rich in the freedom to follow the seasons wherever they led. But even at this golden moment, change was coming. Oh, they couldn't see it yet. Just rumors of strange people far to the east, stories traded around campfires about men with pale skin who built permanent structures and claimed to own the land itself. Some Lakota had encountered these newcomers at trading posts, coming back with coffee beans and metal goods and sugar, luxuries unknown to their ancestors. The first wagon trains were already appearing on the horizon like white-topped beetles, crawling across ancient trails. And with them came something far more deadly than any weapon the whites carried, diseases that would kill more warriors than all the battles to come. Smallpox, cholera, measles, sicknesses for which the Lakota had no medicine, no immunity, no understanding. But in 1840, most Lakota were still free to follow the buffalo herds in the sacred circle of seasons. Children still learned the old stories about when thunder beings danced across prairie skies. Warriors still counted their wealth in horses and their honor in brave deeds. And somewhere in those camps, future leaders were making the choices that would echo through history. Because here's the thing that makes this story so compelling. The Lakota didn't just fade away quietly. When their golden age came under attack, they fought back with a skill and determination that stunned the world. They would win battles that military historians still study today. They would force the United States government to negotiate treaties recognizing their sovereignty. And they would produce leaders whose names are remembered, while the politicians who tried to destroy them are forgotten. But that's getting ahead of our story. Right now, in 1840, the thunder beings were still dancing. The buffalo herds still darkened the prairies. And the Lakota were still masters of a world that seemed as permanent as the sky itself. What they couldn't know was that the first drops of the storm were already beginning to fall. The 1850s brought something that would change everything. Wagon trains, not just a few scattered pioneers, but whole rivers of people flowing across what the Lakota considered their land. These weren't tourists passing through. These were 49ers, gold-hungry men and families racing toward California. And they were turning ancient buffalo trails into highways, carved deep by thousands of wheels. Picture yourself as a Lakota warrior watching this from a distant hill. You've grown up believing that people moved with the seasons, followed the herds, lived lightly on the land. Oh, you're seeing something that makes no sense. White-topped wagons stretching to the horizon, loaded with furniture and farming tools, moving not with nature but against it. These people were cutting straight lines across country that your ancestors had circled for thousands of years. At first, there was curiosity more than hostility. Lakota bands would ride down to trade with wagon trains, exchanging buffalo robes for coffee, sugar, and metal goods. Warriors would circle the wagons in elaborate displays, showing off their horsemanship, while emigrant children peered out from under canvas covers at these exotic riders. Some traders made fortunes facilitating these exchanges, understanding that both sides had something the other wanted. But tensions were building like storm clouds on a summer afternoon. The emigrants were nervous, trigger-happy. They'd heard stories about Indian attacks, stories that grew more terrifying with each telling around campfires. They saw every ridge as hiding potential enemies, every approaching rider as a threat. The Lakota, meanwhile, were confused by people who acted like they owned land they'd never even seen before, who killed buffalo just for their tongues and left the rest to rot, who fouled water sources and cut down trees for no apparent reason. The numbers tell part of the story. In 1850, maybe 5,000 emigrants passed through Lakota territory. By 1852, that number had swelled to 50,000. Imagine living in a small town and suddenly having 10 times your population pass through every year, bringing strange customs, foreign diseases, and fundamentally different ideas about how the world should work. And then came August 19th, 1854. A day that changed everything. It started with something almost ridiculous, a lame cow belonging to a Mormon emigrant named Fleming. The animal wandered away from a wagon train near Fort Laramie and into a Lakota camp. A young Miniconjou warrior named High Forehead butchered it for food. Now, in Lakota society, this was perfectly reasonable. If an animal wandered into your camp, it was a gift from the spirits. But Fleming claimed his cow was stolen and demanded compensation, $25. A significant sum at the time. Lieutenant John Lawrence Grattan, 24 years old, fresh from West Point, full of confidence and completely ignorant about Plains Indian culture, decided this was his moment for glory. He'd been drinking and bragging around Fort Laramie for months, claiming he could ride through the entire Sioux nation with just a few men. The fort's commander, Major Fleming, tried to talk him out of it. But Grattan was determined to make his mark. On the morning of August 19th, Grattan marched out with 29 soldiers, two 12-pound howitzers, and an interpreter named Auguste Lucien, who was probably drunk. They were heading to the camp of Conquering Bear, a respected Brule leader who'd been appointed by the army to serve as chief of all the Lakota, a concept that made no sense to people who governed themselves through consensus rather than hierarchy. When they arrived at the camp, Grattan demanded that High Forehead be turned over for punishment. Conquering Bear tried to negotiate. He offered horses, blankets, anything to avoid bloodshed. The camp had around 4,000 people, men, women, children, elderly, going about their daily business of preparing for winter. This wasn't a war party. These were families. But here's where it gets interesting. Conquering Bear was what we'd call a peace chief, a man appointed by the army to represent his people in negotiations. But among the Lakota, no single person could speak for everyone, especially about something as serious as turning over a warrior for punishment. High Forehead wasn't even from Conquering Bear's band. He was Miniconjou, visiting relatives. The concept made no sense to them. It would be like asking the mayor of Denver to surrender a citizen of Chicago. The negotiations dragged on for hours. Conquering Bear kept offering compensation. Grattan kept demanding the warrior. The situation grew more tense as curious Lakota gathered around the soldiers, who were increasingly nervous about being outnumbered several hundred to one. Some of the younger warriors began making threatening gestures, testing the soldiers' resolve. Finally, around 4 in the afternoon, someone, accounts differ on who, fired the first shot. Some say it was an accidental discharge from a nervous soldier's rifle. Others claim High Forehead himself grabbed a rifle and shot at the troops. What's certain is that within seconds, the situation exploded into violence. Grattan gave the order to fire the howitzers into the camp. The first blast killed Conquering Bear instantly, along with several women and children. And then the Lakota showed Lieutenant Grattan and his men exactly what 29 soldiers could accomplish against several hundred warriors who'd been pushed too far. The fight lasted maybe 10 minutes. When the smoke cleared, every soldier was dead. Grattan's body was found riddled with arrows, so many that witnesses said he looked like a porcupine. The 2 howitzers were captured and would later be turned against American forts. Auguste Lucien, the interpreter, lived long enough to crawl to a nearby trading post and gasp out an account before dying of his wounds. But here's what's crucial to understand. This wasn't random violence or a spontaneous uprising. Young war leaders like Young Man Afraid of His Horses and Red Cloud had been watching American military tactics for years. They understood that soldiers moved in predictable patterns, fought in rigid formations, and depended on supply lines that could be cut. They'd also learned that Americans responded to every defeat with overwhelming force, which meant this incident would bring retaliation. They were right. News of what became known as the Grattan Massacre spread across the frontier like wildfire. Eastern newspapers screamed about savage Indians murdering innocent soldiers. Politicians demanded action. President Franklin Pierce authorized a punitive expedition that would punish the perpetrators and overawe the tribes. General William Selby Harney arrived in 18. 55, with 600 troops and orders to make an example. Harney was a frontier veteran who'd fought Seminoles in Florida and Mexicans in the recent war. He was also a man who believed that the only good Indian was a dead Indian, though he was too diplomatic to say so publicly. At Ash Hollow on September 3rd, 1855, Harney found his target, Little Thunder's peaceful band of Brule Lakota. These people had nothing to do with the Grattan fight. They were camped along the North Platte River, preparing for the fall buffalo hunt. When Little Thunder tried to surrender, Harney ordered the attack anyway. The soldiers killed 86 people, mostly women and children and elderly men. Warriors who might have fought were away hunting. The survivors, around 70 women and children, were marched to Fort Laramie in chains and held as hostages. Harney burned the village, destroyed thousands of pounds of stored food, and killed the horse herd. But instead of intimidating the Lakota, Harney's brutality convinced them that Americans couldn't be trusted and wouldn't honor the traditional distinction between hostile and peaceful bands. If peaceful people camping under government protection could be slaughtered, then no one was safe. The late 1850s brought a new kind of leader to the forefront. Red Cloud wasn't just a warrior. He was a strategic genius who understood that defeating the Americans would require more than individual acts of bravery. Born around 1821, he'd grown up during the transition from the walking to the horse culture. He'd fought traditional enemies like the Pawnee and Crow, but he'd also spent time around trading posts, watching how whites organized themselves, learning their strengths and weaknesses. Red Cloud began forging alliances between traditional enemies, creating a confederation that could coordinate attacks across hundreds of miles. He understood that Plains Indian warfare, with its emphasis on individual bravery and counting coup, would have to evolve to meet this new threat. Instead of scattered raids, they would need sustained campaigns. Instead of competing tribes, they would need unified resistance. Meanwhile, the government tried to solve the Indian problem through negotiation. The Fort Laramie Treaty of 1851 had been an ambitious attempt to define boundaries and establish peace. Thomas Fitzpatrick, the Indian agent who negotiated it, genuinely believed he could create a framework where Indians and whites could coexist. The treaty promised annual payments of $50,000 worth of goods to participating tribes in exchange for safe passage along the emigrant trails, but the negotiations revealed a chasm between worldviews that couldn't be bridged with words on paper. American officials spoke about land ownership, about boundaries drawn on maps, about Indians staying within assigned territories. They showed maps with lines dividing tribal lands, explaining how each group would have its own defined space. To them, this seemed logical and fair. Everyone gets their piece. Everyone stays in their place. But when Lakota leaders tried to explain their perspective, the Americans couldn't or wouldn't understand. How could anyone own the earth any more than they could own the sky? How could you draw lines across country where buffalo roamed freely? How could you promise to stay in one place when the entire foundation of your culture was movement with the seasons? The very concept of permanent boundaries violated everything they understood about the relationship between people and land. Touch the Clouds, a Miniconjou leader who stood nearly 7 feet tall, reportedly told American officials, "You might as well try to make the rivers run uphill as to make us live like white men." When asked to mark his territory on a map, another chief said, "The white man made the map, and the white man can keep it. We will live where the buffalo live." The pressure kept building throughout the decade. Trading posts introduced coffee, sugar, and manufactured goods that were gradually changing Lakota tastes and preferences. Young people especially developed cravings for sweetness unknown to their ancestors. Coffee became a valued trade good, though many older warriors initially refused to drink it, calling it black water that steals sleep. Sugar was even more transformative. Children who tasted it once begged for more, and families began trading valuable buffalo robes for small quantities of the precious white crystals. Some families began depending on trader goods, instead of traditional foods. Metal pots replaced buffalo stomach containers. Steel knives replaced obsidian blades. Wool blankets began appearing alongside traditional robes. It was subtle, but it was changing the culture from within, creating dependencies that would later be exploited. The discovery of gold in Colorado in 1858 brought a new wave of emigrants through Lakota lands. These weren't families heading to California. These were rough men in a hurry, armed and aggressive, with no interest in maintaining peaceful relations with Indians. Mining camps sprang up virtually overnight, each one a source of conflict as prospectors spread out across the landscape, claiming everything they found. And then came 1864, and an atrocity that shocked even frontier-hardened Americans. At Sand Creek in Colorado Territory, a peaceful Cheyenne band, led by Chief Black Kettle, was camped under both an American flag and a white flag of truce. They'd been told by military authorities that they were under government protection as long as they remained peaceful. Colonel John Chivington, a former Methodist minister turned militia commander, had different ideas. He'd been frustrated by his inability to catch hostile Indians, and his term of enlistment was about to expire. He needed a victory to enhance his political career, and a camp full of peaceful Indians seemed like an easy target. On November 29, 1864, Chivington led 700 Colorado volunteers in a dawn attack on Black Kettle's camp. What followed was not a battle, but a massacre. They murdered and mutilated around 150 Cheyenne, mostly women, children, and elderly people. Warriors who might have fought were away hunting. Women holding up American flags were shot down. Children were killed and scalped. Pregnant women were cut open and their unborn children torn out. The soldiers displayed women's body parts as trophies in Denver saloons. They made tobacco pouches from women's breasts and hatbands from children's scalps. When word of these atrocities reached the East, even pro-military newspapers were horrified. A congressional investigation condemned Chivington's actions, but he was never punished. The Sand Creek Massacre sent shockwaves through every Plains tribe. If the Americans would do this to peaceful Indians camping under their own flag, what would they do to hostile ones? The massacre forged alliances between tribes that had been enemies for generations. Lakota, Cheyenne, Arapaho, and others began coordinating their resistance in ways that had never happened before. But even as war clouds gathered, another threat was creeping across the landscape like an iron snake. The Union Pacific Railroad was pushing westward, mile by mile. Construction had begun in 1862 during the Civil War, but by the late 1860s, it was making real progress across the plains. Each spike driven into prairie soil represented progress to white Americans. To the Lakota, it looked like a death sentence for the buffalo hunting way of life. Railroad crews were protected by military escorts, but Lakota war parties struck anyway, tearing up track, burning bridges, killing workers. They derailed trains by loosening rails, then disappeared into the vast grasslands before soldiers could respond. They understood instinctively what the railroad meant: the end of the great buffalo herds, the end of free movement across the plains, the end of everything that made them who they were. Construction workers lived in constant fear. One survivor described waking up to find Indians had crept into camp during the night and stolen everything movable, including the clothes off sleeping men. Another told of a work crew that was attacked while laying track. The Indians killed 3 men, then carefully removed every spike the crew had driven that day before riding away. Yet despite all these pressures, the Lakota were far from defeated. If anything, the constant conflicts were creating a new generation of war leaders who combined traditional courage with tactical innovation. Crazy Horse was perfecting the decoy tactics that would make him famous. Elaborate feints that drew pursuing soldiers into carefully prepared ambushes. Gall was learning to coordinate large-scale cavalry charges that could overwhelm military formations through sheer speed and numbers, and an older generation of leaders like Sitting. Bull was beginning to see that this wasn't just about individual battles anymore. This was about the survival of an entire way of life. Sitting Bull had been born into the Golden Age, when the Lakota were masters of their world. Now in his 30s, he was watching that world come under assault from every direction. The stage was being set for the greatest Indian war in American history. The Lakota had learned painful lessons about American intentions and capabilities. They'd forged new alliances and developed new tactics. Most importantly, they'd realized that there could be no compromise with people who demanded total surrender of everything that made life worth living. But they'd also tasted coffee and sugar, used metal tools, and seen the awesome industrial power that was bearing down on them. Some of their leaders were beginning to understand that they were fighting not just an army, but an entire civilization that seemed as unstoppable as a prairie fire. The question wasn't whether war would come. The question was whether the Lakota could win it before their golden age disappeared forever under the weight of an advancing world they never made. And in the mountains of Wyoming, along a trail that would become known as the Bozeman Trail, that question was about to be answered in blood. 1866 witnessed something that had never happened before in American history and would never happen again. Red Cloud, a war leader who understood both traditional Lakota tactics and modern military strategy, orchestrated the most successful Native American military campaign against the United States. For 2 years, he turned the Powder River country into a graveyard for American ambitions, forcing the most powerful military in the world to admit defeat and abandon their forts. The spark that ignited this war was gold, again, but this time it wasn't California gold or Colorado gold, it was Montana gold, discovered in the Bitterroot Mountains in 1862. The problem was getting there. The traditional route went west along the Oregon Trail, then north through Idaho Territory, a journey of nearly 2,000 miles that took months and cost a fortune in supplies. But there was a shortcut. John Bozeman, a Georgia immigrant with more ambition than sense, had blazed a trail that cut directly north from Fort Laramie through the Powder River Basin to the Montana goldfields. The Bozeman Trail, as it became known, could cut weeks off the journey and save thousands of dollars in expenses. There was just one problem. It ran straight through the heart of the last great hunting grounds, violating every treaty the government had signed with the Lakota. Now think about this from Red Cloud's perspective. He was around 45 years old, a veteran of countless battles with traditional enemies, a man who'd watched his people's world shrink with each passing year. The California emigrants had been bad enough, but they were just passing through. The Colorado miners had been worse, but they were mostly south of Lakota territory. The Bozeman Trail was different. This cut right through Pahasapa, the sacred Black Hills, and the Powder River country, where the last great buffalo herd still roamed. Red Cloud understood that if this trail opened, it would be the beginning of the end. First would come the miners, then the settlers, then the railroad. The pattern was always the same. Within a generation, the buffalo would be gone, the grass would be plowed under, and his people would be prisoners on some distant reservation. So he made a decision that would echo through history. He would stop the trail, not just raid it occasionally, not just make it dangerous. He would close it completely, and he would use every tool at his disposal to do it. The army thought they could protect the trail with 3 forts, Fort Reno, Fort Phil Kearny, and Fort C.F. Smith, strung out along the route like beads on a string. Colonel Henry Carrington arrived in the summer of 1866 with about 700 men and orders to make the trail safe for civilian traffic. Carrington was a capable administrator, but not a frontier fighter. He'd spent most of the Civil War behind a desk in Washington, organizing regiments and managing supplies. Now he found himself trying to control 300 miles of hostile territory with forces spread too thin and supply lines stretched too far. Red Cloud's strategy was brilliant in its simplicity. Instead of attacking the forts directly, he made it impossible for anyone to leave them safely. Woodcutting parties were ambushed. Supply trains were attacked. Hunting parties disappeared. Mail carriers were killed. Within months, the forts had become prisons, their garrisons trapped inside log walls, while Red Cloud's warriors controlled everything outside. The psychological pressure was enormous. Soldiers lived in constant fear, never knowing when an arrow might come whistling out of the grass. Every routine patrol became a potential death sentence. Men began deserting, despite the harsh penalties. Others simply cracked under the stress, talking to themselves or jumping at shadows. But Red Cloud wasn't just relying on traditional hit-and-run tactics. He was coordinating a coalition that included not just Lakota, but Cheyenne and Arapaho warriors as well. Different bands would strike simultaneously at points hundreds of miles apart, making it impossible for the army to predict where the next attack would come. It was modern warfare, strategic, coordinated, and devastatingly effective. And then came December 21st, 1866, the Fetterman fight. The day that proved Red Cloud wasn't just lucky, he was a military genius. Captain William Judd Fetterman was everything Carrington wasn't. Aggressive, confident, eager for action. He'd served with distinction in the Civil War and had nothing but contempt for Indian fighting ability. "Give me 80 men," he famously boasted, "and I can ride through the entire Sioux nation." On that December morning, he got exactly what he asked for. A woodcutting party near Fort Phil Kearny was under attack, and Carrington ordered Fetterman to relieve them with explicit orders not to pursue the Indians beyond Lodge Trail Ridge. But when Fetterman saw a small party of warriors apparently fleeing, he couldn't resist the chase. What he didn't know was that he was watching Crazy Horse in action. The young war leader had perfected the art of the decoy, drawing enemies into carefully prepared ambushes through a combination of apparent vulnerability and tactical brilliance. Crazy Horse would ride just close enough to tempt pursuit, then disappear over a ridge, always staying just out of range, but close enough to keep the soldiers coming. Fetterman's command, exactly 80 men, followed the decoys over Lodge Trail Ridge and into a valley where nearly 2,000 warriors were waiting. The fight lasted less than an hour. When it was over, every soldier was dead, their bodies stripped and mutilated according to Plains Indian custom. But here's what made this victory so devastating to American morale. It wasn't a lucky ambush or a spontaneous attack. This was planned, coordinated, and executed with military precision. Red Cloud had studied American tactics, identified their weaknesses, and exploited them perfectly. The decoy strategy, the choice of battlefield, the coordination of multiple war parties, everything demonstrated that the Lakota could match American military professionals at their own game. The news stunned the nation. How could 80 trained soldiers, armed with the latest rifles and led by a Civil War veteran, be wiped out by Indians with bows and arrows? The answer was that they weren't fighting primitive savages. They were fighting sophisticated military tacticians who had adapted traditional methods to defeat modern enemies. Carrington was relieved of command and replaced by Colonel Henry Wessels, who had even less success controlling the Powder River country. Red Cloud's warriors continued their campaign through 1867, making the Bozeman Trail virtually impassable. Wagon trains that attempted the journey faced constant attack. Many turned back rather than risk the crossing. Others made it through only by traveling in heavily armed convoys that resembled military expeditions more than civilian traffic. The economic pressure was enormous. Montana businessmen, desperate for supplies and new settlers, petitioned Washington for more military protection. Army contractors complained about the impossible conditions for supplying the forts. Politicians faced difficult questions about why the most powerful military in the world couldn't keep a single trail open. Meanwhile, Red Cloud was receiving support from unexpected sources. Eastern reformers, horrified by events like the Sand Creek Massacre, were questioning the morality of the Indian Wars. Newspapers began reporting on the legitimate grievances of native peoples. Some congressmen argued that it would be cheaper and more humane to negotiate than to fight. The turning point came in 1867 when a peace commission arrived to negotiate an end to the conflict. The commission included some of the most prominent Americans of the era: General William Tecumseh Sherman, General Alfred Terry, and Senator John Henderson. They had authority to make real concessions, and they needed Red Cloud's cooperation to end a war that was proving both expensive and embarrassing. But Red Cloud wasn't interested in talking while American soldiers still occupied his territory. His conditions were simple and non-negotiable: abandon the forts along the Bozeman Trail, remove all military forces from the Powder River country, and guarantee that the area would remain off-limits to white settlement. Only then would he consider making peace. The government's initial response was predictable: more threats, more demands for unconditional surrender, more promises of military action. But Red Cloud had proven that his threats weren't empty. The Bozeman Trail remained closed. The forts remained under siege, and every month the war continued, cost the Treasury thousands of dollars while producing no results. The final negotiations took place at Fort Laramie in the spring of 1868. Red Cloud's demands had become the government's terms. The Treaty of Fort Laramie granted the Lakota ownership of the Black Hills for as long as grass grows and water flows, language that seemed to promise permanent protection. The Powder River country was designated as unceded Indian territory, where no whites could settle or even travel without permission. Most importantly, from Red Cloud's perspective, the Army agreed to abandon Forts Reno, Phil Kearny, and C.F. Smith. American soldiers would march out, and the Lakota would be free to burn the structures that had represented the invasion of their homeland. On November 6, 1868, Red Cloud finally arrived at Fort Laramie to sign the treaty. He'd refused to negotiate while the forts remained occupied, demonstrating a political sophistication that impressed even his enemies. When the last soldiers marched out of Fort Phil Kearny, Lakota warriors burned it to the ground, sending smoke signals that could be seen for miles, a message that the Powder River country belonged to them again. But Red Cloud's victory came with unexpected consequences. The war had transformed him from a traditional war leader into something new, an Indian statesman who had to deal with the realities of American power while protecting his people's interests. In 1870, he traveled to Washington at the government's invitation, becoming the first Plains Indian leader to visit the nation's capital. What he saw there changed everything. Red Cloud walked through cities with buildings taller than hills, rode trains that moved faster than the swiftest horse, and saw crowds of white people that numbered more than all the Indians on the Great Plains combined. At a reception, he was served coffee and sugar in fine china cups, luxuries that his people now traded buffalo robes to obtain from frontier merchants. The experience was overwhelming. Red Cloud reportedly told his hosts, "When I was here before, I gave you my word that I would not fight anymore, and you gave me your word that there would be no more fighting. I see now that you have more people than there are leaves on the trees. I understand now why you wanted peace." When he returned to the Powder River country, Red Cloud faced a dilemma that would define the rest of his life. He'd won the war and secured the best treaty any Indian nation had ever negotiated with the United States. But he'd also seen the future, and he knew that his victory was temporary. The American nation was too large, too powerful, and too determined to be stopped permanently by military action. Younger leaders like Sitting Bull and Crazy Horse, who had fought in Red Cloud's war but never seen Washington, couldn't understand his change in attitude. They'd proven that Americans could be defeated in battle. They'd forced the most powerful government in the world to abandon its forts and recognize their sovereignty. Why should they compromise with people they'd already beaten? But Red Cloud understood something his younger colleagues didn't, that their military victory had been won against the frontier army, not the full power of the American state. During his visit to Washington, he'd seen factories that could produce more rifles in a day than his people owned in total. He'd seen railroad yards with enough locomotives to transport entire armies. He'd seen the arsenal, where weapons were stored that could arm 1 million soldiers. The coffee and sugar that were becoming staples of Lakota diet came from those factories. transported on those railroads, paid for with money from that industrial economy. Even his victory had made his people more dependent on the very civilization they were fighting. Red Cloud began advocating for accommodation, not surrender, but a recognition that the old ways of warfare couldn't protect the Lakota forever. He started sending his children to government schools, learning to read and write English, engaging with the Indian agent system. To warriors who had followed him into battle, this looked like betrayal, but Red Cloud was playing a longer game. He understood that the next war, and there would be a next war, couldn't be won with arrows and war ponies. It would have to be won with lawyers and politicians and treaties. The skills his children learned in white schools might be the only weapons that could protect Lakota interests in the world that was coming. The Treaty of Fort Laramie was supposed to bring lasting peace, but Red Cloud knew better. He'd seen too much to believe that Americans would honor promises any longer than it suited their interests. The Black Hills contained minerals that white men valued. The railroad would eventually cross Lakota territory. The buffalo herds were already shrinking under pressure from commercial hunters. The question wasn't whether the treaty would be broken. It was when, and whether the Lakota would be ready for what came next. Red Cloud had won the only war Native Americans would ever win against the United States. But as he watched younger warriors celebrate their victory, he was already preparing for the defeat he knew must follow. The peace that Red Cloud had won with his brilliant war lasted exactly 6 years. 6 years of promises kept and treaties honored. 6 years of Lakota children learning that maybe, just maybe, they could trust the word of the American government. And then, in the summer of 1874, everything changed because of something glittering in a creek bed in the Black Hills. George Armstrong Custer, long hair to the Lakota, led an expedition into Pahasapa that was supposedly scientific. The official mission was to map the region, study its resources, and select a site for a military post. But everyone knew what they were really looking for. Rumors of gold in the Black Hills had been circulating for years, whispered around trading posts and repeated in frontier newspapers. On July 30th, 1874, those rumors became reality. Horatio Ross, a civilian miner attached to Custer's expedition, found gold flakes in French Creek. Within hours, word spread through the entire column. Soldiers were panning for gold with their mess kits. Officers were writing excited letters home, and Custer himself was composing dispatches that would change the course of history. Gold has been found at several places, Custer wrote to his superiors, and it is the belief of those who are giving their attention to this subject that it will be found in paying quantities. Think about what this meant to the Lakota. The Black Hills weren't just another piece of territory to them. They were the sacred center of their universe, the place where the spirits dwelled, where young men went to seek visions, where the bones of their ancestors rested in hidden caves. Pahasapa was literally the heart of their world, and the Treaty of Fort Laramie had promised it would remain theirs forever. But forever turned out to be 6 years. The moment Custer's dispatches reached the telegraph lines, the gold rush began. Within months, 15,000 miners were pouring into the Black Hills, setting up camps with names like Deadwood and Lead, tearing up creek beds and mountainsides in their frantic search for wealth. The government made a half-hearted attempt to keep them out, sending troops to arrest trespassers and escort them back to the territorial boundaries. But for every miner they removed, 10 more appeared. President Ulysses Grant faced an impossible situation. The Treaty of Fort Laramie legally required him to keep miners out of the Black Hills, but he couldn't use the army to shoot American citizens who were simply trying to get rich. The political pressure was enormous. Western congressmen demanded that the hills be opened. Eastern newspapers editorialized about the waste of keeping valuable resources locked away from development. And mining companies offered huge sums for extraction rights. The government's solution was simple and cynical: buy the Black Hills from the Lakota. In 1875, a commission headed by Senator William Allison arrived at Red Cloud Agency to negotiate the purchase. The commissioners brought wagon loads of coffee, sugar, and trade goods, assuming they could overwhelm the Indians with generosity and close the deal quickly, but they'd misunderstood everything about Lakota culture and politics. The commissioners expected to negotiate with a few chiefs who could speak for all the Lakota. Instead, they found themselves facing thousands of people with hundreds of different opinions, operating under a consensus system that required virtual unanimity for major decisions. The negotiations were a disaster from the start. When the commissioners suggested a price of $6 million for the Black Hills, the Lakota leaders laughed. Spotted Tail, one of the more accommodating chiefs, told them that $600 million wouldn't be enough. Red Cloud stood up and walked away without saying a word. And from the back of the crowd, younger warriors shouted that the hills were not for sale at any price. But it was the arrival of the non-agency Indians that really doomed the negotiations. These were Lakota, who had never accepted government supervision, who still lived the old way in the Powder River country. Sitting Bull came, along with Crazy Horse and their followers, maybe 3,000 people who represented everything the commissioners were trying to eliminate. Sitting Bull's speech to the commission has been preserved in several accounts, and it cuts right to the heart of the conflict. "What treaty that the whites have kept has the red man broken?" he asked. "Not one. What treaty that the whites ever made with us red men have they kept? Not one. When I was a boy, the Sioux owned the world. The sun rose and set in their lands. They sent 10,000 horsemen to battle. Where are the warriors today? Who slew them? Where are our lands? Who owns them?" The speech went on for an hour, a litany of broken promises and stolen territory. When Sitting Bull finished, he stalked out of the negotiations, taking most of the non-agency Indians with him. The message was clear. There would be no sale, no compromise, no surrender of the sacred hills. The commissioners returned to Washington empty-handed, but their failure had been predetermined. Even before they left for the negotiations, President Grant had secretly decided that if the Lakota wouldn't sell, the government would simply take the hills by force. On November 3, 1875, Grant held a White House meeting with his key advisors where they planned exactly how to provoke a war that would justify seizing the Black Hills. The plan was elegant in its cynicism. The government would demand that all Lakota return to their agencies by January 31st, 1876. Anyone who remained in the Powder River country after that date would be considered hostile and subject to military action. Of course, they knew perfectly well that it was impossible for people living hundreds of miles away to receive the message and travel to the agencies in the middle of winter. The deadline was designed to be missed. When January 31st passed with thousands of Lakota still in their winter camps, the War Department declared them hostile and authorized military action. General Philip Sheridan, commanding the Division of the Missouri, developed a three-pronged campaign designed to crush the hostiles once and for all. General George Crook would advance north from Fort Fetterman. Colonel John Gibbon would march east from Fort Ellis in Montana, and General Alfred Terry, with Lieutenant Colonel George Custer's 7th Cavalry, would move west from Fort Abraham Lincoln in Dakota Territory. The three columns would converge on the Powder River country, trapping the Lakota between them and forcing a decisive battle. It was a sound strategy, used successfully in other Indian campaigns. But it depended on several assumptions that would prove fatally wrong. The generals assumed they were hunting scattered bands of a few hundred warriors each. They assumed the Lakota would run when confronted with superior firepower. And they assumed that Custer's Civil War, reputation, and aggressive tactics would intimidate any Indians foolish enough to stand and fight. What they didn't know was that the largest gathering of Plains Indians in history was forming along the Little Bighorn River, the Sioux. Government's ultimatum had backfired spectacularly. Instead of forcing submission, it had united every faction of Lakota society in resistance. Agency Indians, angry about reduced rations and broken promises, slipped away from government supervision to join their free relatives. Traditional enemies like the Cheyenne and Arapaho made common cause with the Lakota. Even some Crow warriors, despite their tribe's alliance with the army, quietly joined the growing camp. By June 1876, perhaps 15,000 people were gathered along the Little Bighorn, the largest concentration of Native Americans ever assembled on the Great Plains. Among them were 3,000 warriors, many armed with repeating rifles obtained through trade or captured from previous battles. They were well supplied, highly motivated, and led by some of the most capable military leaders their cultures had produced. Sitting Bull, now in his mid-40s, was the spiritual leader of this gathering. He'd called for a great sundance in early June, where he had a vision that would prove prophetic. After dancing for hours with 50 pieces of flesh cut from his arms as an offering, Sitting Bull saw soldiers falling upside down into the Indian camp like grasshoppers from the sky. The vision electrified the gathering. The spirits had promised victory. Crazy Horse, in his early 30s and at the peak of his powers, commanded the Oglala warriors. He'd perfected the hit-and-run tactics that had made Red Cloud's war so successful. But now he was preparing for something different, a pitched battle where superior numbers and terrain advantages could overwhelm American firepower, and there was Gall, the Hunkpapa war leader, whose tactical genius complemented Crazy Horse's innovative strategies. Gall understood how to coordinate large-scale cavalry charges, how to use terrain to maximum advantage, and how to exploit the weaknesses in American military doctrine. On June 17th, this coalition got its first test when Crook's column encountered Crazy Horse's warriors at Rosebud Creek. The Battle of the Rosebud lasted 6 hours and ended with Crook withdrawing from the field. The general claimed victory, but he was so mauled that he spent the next 6 weeks licking his wounds instead of continuing his advance. One prong of Sheridan's three-pronged strategy had already been eliminated. Meanwhile, Custer was advancing up the Rosebud with the 7th Cavalry, unaware that Crook had been defeated and that he was now facing the entire Indian coalition alone. Terry's original plan called for Custer to continue south, while Gibbon's column approached from the west, but Custer had convinced his superior to let him scout ahead with his own regiment. On June 25th, Custer's Crow scouts reported a massive Indian camp along the Little Bighorn River. From a ridge called the Crow's Nest, they could see pony herds that stretched for miles and smoke from countless cooking fires. The scouts urged Custer to wait for reinforcements, warning that there were more Indians ahead than bullets in his soldiers' belts. But Custer was in a hurry. He was concerned that the Indians might scatter before he could attack, and he was eager for the kind of dramatic victory that would enhance his political ambitions. At 36, Custer was already thinking about a career beyond the army, and defeating the Sioux would make him a national hero. Around noon on June 25th, Custer divided his command into 3 battalions. Major Marcus Reno would attack the southern end of the village with 140 men. Captain Frederick Benteen would scout to the south with 125 men to prevent escape in that direction. Custer himself would take 215 men and attack from the north, striking what he assumed was the main camp. It was a textbook cavalry tactic: divide the enemy's attention, attack from multiple directions, and use superior mobility to prevent organized resistance. The strategy had worked in previous Indian fights, where small bands of warriors broke and ran when faced with disciplined soldiers. But this wasn't a small band. This was a city of 15,000 people stretching for miles along the river. And these weren't demoralized reservation Indians. These were free warriors fighting for everything they held sacred. Reno's attack began the battle around 3 in the afternoon. His battalion charged into the southern end of the village, expecting to scatter the inhabitants and drive them toward Custer's advancing column. Instead, they rode into a wall of gunfire from warriors hidden in the timber along the river. Within minutes, Reno's charge had stalled. His men dismounted and fighting desperately for their lives. Gall led the counterattack that drove Reno's troops back across the Little Bighorn and up onto the bluffs, where they barely managed to establish a defensive perimeter. Reno had lost nearly half his command in less than an hour, and the survivors were pinned down under constant fire. But the real drama was unfolding 4 miles to the north, where Custer was leading his battalion toward what he thought was a fleeing village. Instead, he found himself facing the largest concentration of Indian warriors in American history. Crazy Horse had positioned hundreds of warriors in the ravines and coulees that led down to the river, creating a series of natural ambush positions that would channel the cavalry attack into killing fields. The battle that followed lasted perhaps an hour. Custer's men fought bravely, but they were overwhelmed by sheer numbers and superior tactics. Warriors who had grown up hunting buffalo on horseback proved more than a match for cavalry troopers who had learned to fight dismounted. The Lakota and Cheyenne fighters used the terrain to their advantage, firing from concealed positions while mounted warriors circled the increasingly desperate soldiers. At some point during the fight, Custer ordered his men to shoot their horses and use the bodies as breastworks, a sign of how desperate the situation had become. But there was no escape from the trap he'd ridden into. Warriors swarmed up the ravines and charged down from the ridges, closing the circle until no soldier remained alive. When the smoke cleared, Custer and every man in his immediate command lay dead. 215 soldiers had been wiped out in less time than it takes to eat dinner. Among the dead were Custer's brother Tom, his nephew Orty Reed, and his brother-in-law James Calhoun. The 7th Cavalry had been decimated by an enemy they'd underestimated, and a strategy that had backfired catastrophically. Warriors later recalled finding strange items on the soldiers: bodies, coffee grounds scattered from torn sacks, sugar cubes melting in the prairie heat, hardtack crackers that crumbled to dust when touched. These were the foods that had become staples of military life, but they seemed as foreign to the Lakota as the men who carried them. Some warriors tried eating the hardtack but spat it out, declaring it fit only for horses. The victory celebration that night was unlike anything the Plains tribes had ever experienced. Thousands of warriors danced around enormous fires, singing songs that would be passed down through generations. Women trilled victory songs while children played with captured cavalry equipment. For one shining moment, it seemed like the old days had returned, when Indian warriors could defeat any enemy and the buffalo hunting way of life would continue forever. But even as the victory songs echoed across the Little Bighorn Valley, older leaders understood what this triumph would cost them. Sitting Bull, who had foreseen the victory in his Sundance vision, now had darker premonitions about what would follow. The American nation, celebrating its centennial year, would never accept such a humiliation. The full weight of American military power would soon descend on the Plains tribes like a prairie fire. Crazy Horse reportedly told fellow warriors that they had won the battle but lost the war. The great gathering began breaking up within days, bands scattering in different directions, as leaders realized they couldn't remain concentrated without becoming an easy target for revenge. The unity that had made victory possible was already fragmenting under the pressure of what victory would bring. Because here's the thing that makes Custer's last stand so tragic. It was both the greatest Indian victory and the beginning of the end. The Lakota and their allies had proven they could defeat the U.S. Army in open battle, but in doing so, they'd guaranteed their own destruction. The coffee and sugar that were found scattered among the dead soldiers would soon become the only sustenance available to the survivors, distributed by the same government whose soldiers they'd just annihilated. The Golden Age was ending in a blaze of glory that lit the way to captivity. The revenge came swiftly and mercilessly. News of Custer's defeat reached the outside world on July 4, 1876, America's centennial celebration. While the nation was congratulating itself on 100 years of progress and freedom, telegraph operators were tapping out the most shocking military disaster in frontier history. The timing couldn't have been worse for the Lakota. A humiliated nation demanded blood. General Philip Sheridan, the architect of total war against the Confederacy, now turned those same tactics against the Plains tribes. His strategy was brutally simple: make winter the enemy. Attack when families were most vulnerable, destroy food supplies, kill horse herds, and force the survivors to choose between starvation and surrender. The more we can kill this year, Sheridan told his subordinates, the less will have to be killed the next war. These savages must learn that they cannot murder our people with impunity. The winter of 1876 to 77 became known among the Lakota as the Starving Time, a season of suffering that broke the spirit of resistance that had sustained them for decades. It began in November when Colonel Ranald Mackenzie struck the Cheyenne village of Dull Knife in the Bighorn Mountains. Picture this scene. It's dawn on November 25th, and temperatures are already below zero. Mackenzie's cavalry charges through a sleeping village of 200 lodges, home to over 1,000 people. The attack is sudden and devastating. Soldiers torch teepees while families are still inside, shoot down anyone who tries to flee, and systematically destroy everything the Cheyenne need to survive winter. But this wasn't just destruction for its own sake. This was calculated warfare designed to eliminate a people's ability to exist independently. Mackenzie's men burned 40,000 pounds of dried buffalo meat, enough food to sustain the entire band through winter. They destroyed countless buffalo robes, the difference between warmth and freezing death on the northern plains. Most cruelly, they shot 700 ponies, the animals that gave Plains Indians their mobility and independence. Dull Knife's people escaped into the mountains with nothing but the clothes they wore. 11 babies froze to death during the first night of flight. Mothers wrapped infants in their own clothing and watched helplessly as tiny fingers and toes turned black with frostbite. Warriors who had counted coup on Custer's soldiers now begged their families to eat strips of leather cut from their own moccasins. The survivors staggered through snow-covered mountains for 11 days before reaching Crazy Horse's camp. When they arrived, they looked like walking skeletons, hollow-eyed, frostbitten, barely human. Children who had once played in prosperous villages now fought over scraps of raw hide. Women who had owned dozens of beautifully decorated dresses now wore rags that barely covered their nakedness. But Dull Knife's destruction was just the beginning. Throughout that terrible winter, similar attacks fell on scattered bands across the northern plains. At Slim Buttes, at Cedar Creek, at Wolf Mountain, wherever soldiers found Indian camps, they brought fire and death. The pattern was always the same: dawn attacks on sleeping villages, systematic destruction of food and shelter, pursuit of fleeing survivors into the frozen wilderness. The psychological impact was as devastating as the physical suffering. For generations, Lakota families had faced winter with confidence, sustained by careful preparation and abundant buffalo herds. Now they were reduced to scavenging, eating their horses when the meat ran out, boiling rawhide into a bitter soup that barely sustained life. Colonel Nelson Miles, commanding the winter campaign in eastern Montana, perfected the art of making survival impossible. His troops didn't just attack villages, they hunted individual families across the frozen landscape, forcing them to keep moving when rest meant death. Miles understood that constant pursuit would break down resistance more effectively than any single battle. At the Battle of Wolf Mountain on January 8th, 1877, Crazy Horse made one last attempt to drive away the soldiers who were hounding his people. Fighting in sub-zero temperatures with weapons that jammed from the cold, his warriors attacked Miles' column in a blizzard that reduced visibility to yards. But the ammunition ran low, the ponies stumbled in snowdrifts, and the attack collapsed into desperate retreat. After Wolf Mountain, Crazy Horse knew the war was lost, not because his warriors lacked courage, but because they lacked everything else. You can't fight an enemy who has unlimited supplies when your own people are eating their horses. You can't maintain resistance when your children are freezing to death. You can't preserve independence when independence means starvation. The surrender began in the spring of 1877. Not all at once, but in a steady trickle of broken families trudging toward the agencies they had once scorned. Red Cloud's people came first, then Spotted Tail's. Then smaller bands led by chiefs whose names would be forgotten while their suffering echoed through generations. But all eyes were on Crazy Horse, the strange man of the Oglala, the warrior who had never owned more than he could carry, the leader who gave away everything and asked for nothing. If Crazy Horse surrendered, the war was truly over. On May 5, 1877, Crazy Horse led 900 people into Fort Robinson, Nebraska. The procession stretched for miles. Warriors who had terrorized the frontier now riding beside travois, carrying sick children and elderly relatives barely clinging to life. Ponies that had once carried victorious war parties now pulled makeshift sleds loaded with the pitiful remnants of a proud people's possessions. The transformation was immediate and shocking. Warriors who had lived on buffalo, wild turnips, and spring water now lined up for army rations like beggars at a soup kitchen. The first distribution caused confusion and cultural shock that observers would remember for decades. Coffee was the greatest mystery. Many Lakota had encountered it through trade, but others had never tasted the bitter black liquid that whites seemed to consider essential. Older warriors spat it out immediately, declaring it poison. Some tried to eat the beans raw, grimacing at the harsh taste. Others mixed the grounds with water but refused to heat it, creating a muddy mess that satisfied no one. Touch the Clouds, the 7-foot giant who had once terrorized frontier settlements, was reportedly seen trying to drink coffee from a tin cup too small for his massive hands. He took one sip, made a face that sent children running, and declared that it tasted like burnt water from a dead tree. But within weeks, even Touch the Clouds was lining up for his daily ration. Addiction gradually replacing revulsion. Sugar created even more confusion. Plains Indians had known sweetness only from wild berries, tree sap, and occasional honey. The concentrated sweetness of refined sugar was overwhelming, almost painful to taste buds accustomed to subtle flavors. Children who tried it once became desperate for more, begging parents to trade valuable possessions for small quantities of the white crystals. Some families mixed sugar with their traditional pemmican, creating combinations that horrified tribal elders. Others sprinkled it on everything, trying to make army hardtack and canned beef palatable. Within months, sugar had become more valuable than silver among reservation families, and children were developing cravings that would last lifetimes. But the most shocking transformation was in the warriors themselves. Men who had counted coup on enemies now competed for favor with Indian agents. Chiefs who had led thousands of followers now petitioned for extra rations like supplicants before a king. The very concept of leadership was changing as traditional authority based on generosity and military prowess gave way to bureaucratic appointment and government. Approval, the reservation system destroyed traditional social structures as efficiently as winter campaigns had destroyed villages. Families that had lived together for generations were assigned to different agencies based on arbitrary bureaucratic decisions. Children were separated from elders who carried tribal knowledge. Warriors were forbidden to hunt, the activity that had defined masculine identity for countless generations. Instead of following buffalo herds in the sacred circle of seasons, people now gathered around agency buildings on ration day, waiting for handouts that barely sustained life. Instead of rich buffalo meat and fresh vegetables gathered from the prairie, they ate salt pork, hardtack, and canned goods that their digestive systems couldn't properly process. Diseases that had been rare among mobile hunter-gatherers, diabetes, obesity, depression, began appearing with alarming frequency. The psychological impact was as devastating as the physical. Warriors who had measured wealth by the number of horses they could give away now measured it by the amount of government commodity food they could accumulate. Women who had taken pride in creating beautiful clothing and shelter from buffalo hides now depended on cheap manufactured goods, distributed by agents who understood nothing about their culture. But perhaps the cruelest transformation involved the children. Lakota boys, who should have been learning to hunt and fight, were instead attending government schools where they were beaten for speaking their native language. Girls who should have been learning traditional crafts from grandmothers were instead practicing European domestic skills that had no relevance to their lives. The coffee and sugar that had once been exotic luxuries now became daily necessities, creating dependencies that made resistance impossible. How could families return to the old ways when their children had developed cravings for foods that existed only in the white world? How could warriors maintain their independence when their wives expected coffee every morning and their children cried for sugar every evening? Crazy Horse himself became a symbol of the impossible choices facing his people. At Fort Robinson, he tried to maintain his traditional lifestyle, refusing government housing and living in a tipi outside the agency buildings. But even he couldn't escape the new realities. His followers expected him to negotiate for better rations, to represent their interests to government officials, to become the kind of political leader that traditional Lakota society had never required. The tensions exploded on September 5th, 1877, when Crazy Horse was arrested on charges of planning to leave the reservation. The exact circumstances remain disputed, but witnesses agree that he was bayoneted during a struggle at the guardhouse, dying a few hours later while his friends held vigil outside. Some claimed he was trying to escape. Others insisted he was murdered by jealous rivals who had convinced authorities he was dangerous. What's certain is that his death marked the end of an era. The last great war leader of the plains was gone, killed not in battle, but in a bureaucratic dispute over reservation regulations. Sitting Bull's story was different, but equally tragic. After Custer's defeat, he had led his followers into Canada, where they lived in exile for 4 years. But even the Queen's protection couldn't shield them from starvation, as buffalo herds disappeared, and American authorities pressured Canadian officials to deny the refugees supplies. By 1881, Sitting Bull's band was reduced to eating their horses, then their dogs, then anything they could find. Children were dying of malnutrition, while warriors too weak to hunt watched helplessly. Finally, with fewer than 200 followers still alive, Sitting Bull returned to the United States and surrendered at Fort Buford. His reception was carefully orchestrated humiliation. Photographers documented every moment as the great war leader handed over his rifle to his young son, who then presented it to the commanding officer. The symbolism was deliberate, the old generation surrendering power to children who would grow up as wards of the government. Like Crazy Horse, Sitting Bull struggled to adapt to reservation life. He learned to drink coffee, though he never acquired a taste for it. He developed a sweet tooth that led him to trade valuable possessions for small amounts of sugar. He watched his grandchildren prefer commodity foods to traditional dishes and English words to Lakota prayers. But perhaps the most telling symbol of the transformation was what happened to the sacred pipe. For generations, Lakota ceremonies had centered around elaborate rituals involving pipes carved from red stone and filled with traditional tobacco mixed with kinnikinnick. Now reservation families were smoking government-issued tobacco in mass-produced pipes, and even sacred ceremonies began incorporating foreign elements. Coffee began appearing in purification rituals, mixed with traditional herbs, in combinations that would have horrified previous generations. Sugar was offered to spirits alongside traditional gifts of tobacco and sage. Children who participated in these hybrid ceremonies grew up thinking they were following ancient traditions, unaware that they were witnessing the gradual dissolution of their culture. The starving time had ended, but it had left scars that would never heal. A people who had once controlled territory from the Missouri River to the Bighorn Mountains were now confined to scattered reservations, dependent on government handouts for survival. Warriors who had defeated the United States Army in open battle now competed for the favor of petty bureaucrats who held the power of life and death through ration distributions. The Golden Age was over. The age of captivity had begun. And somewhere in government warehouses, clerks were documenting the new reality with careful statistics. So many pounds of coffee distributed per family. So many pounds of sugar allocated per person. So many former warriors now dependent on foods they had never tasted before their defeat. The thunder beings had stopped dancing. The great circle was broken, and the Lakota people faced a future that none of their ancestors could have imagined. A future where survival itself depended on accepting the charity of their conquerors and learning to crave the bitter taste of a foreign world. The 1880s brought something worse than war: systematic cultural destruction disguised as civilization. The scattered reservations where the Lakota now lived weren't just geographic boundaries. They were laboratories for an experiment in human engineering designed to eliminate everything that made the Lakota who they were. Picture walking into Standing Rock Agency in 1885. What you'd see would shock you more than any battlefield. Warriors who had terrorized the frontier were now standing in line with tin cups, waiting for their daily coffee ration like prisoners waiting for gruel. Children who should have been learning to hunt buffalo were instead sitting in wooden desks, reciting English alphabet songs while government teachers beat them for speaking Lakota. The man orchestrating this transformation was Agent James McLaughlin, an Irish immigrant who believed he was saving the Indians from themselves. McLaughlin had perfected what he called the Civilization Program, a comprehensive system that regulated every aspect of Lakota life from sunrise to sunset. He wasn't just an administrator. He was an architect of cultural genocide, and he approached his work with the methodical efficiency of an engineer solving a technical problem. McLaughlin's first innovation was turning Indians into police officers. The Indian police force wasn't just about maintaining order. It was about forcing Lakota people to enforce their own destruction. Warriors who had once led war parties were now arresting their own relatives for practicing traditional ceremonies. Chiefs who had counted coup on enemies were now serving warrants on medicine men who conducted healing rituals. The psychological impact was devastating. Traditional Lakota society had been based on consensus and voluntary cooperation. Now families were torn apart by government-appointed police who had authority to arrest anyone who violated regulations most people couldn't even read. Parents watched helplessly as their own sons, wearing blue uniforms and carrying handcuffs, dragged away elders whose only crime was singing ancient songs. But McLaughlin's masterstroke was controlling food distribution. Daily rations became weapons of social control, more effective than any army. Families who obeyed regulations received their full allotment of coffee, sugar, flour, and beef. Those who violated agency rules by practicing traditional religion, by speaking Lakota in public, by refusing to cut their hair, watched their children go hungry. The morning coffee distribution became a daily ritual of humiliation. Warriors who had once awakened to the sound of prairie winds now lined up at dawn, outside agency buildings, holding tin cups and waiting for their ration of bitter black liquid. The coffee was often made from low-grade beans, mixed with chicory and other adulterants. But families had become so dependent on the caffeine that withdrawal caused painful headaches and depression. Children were particularly vulnerable to this systematic dependency. Young Lakota, who had never tasted sugar before their family's surrender, now threw tantrums when the sweet rations ran short. Mothers, who had once fed their babies buffalo milk, now mixed condensed cow's milk with sugar water, creating the first generation of Lakota children whose taste buds were formed by government commodity foods. The sugar rations were calculated to create maximum dependency with minimum cost. Each family received exactly enough to make children crave more, but never enough to satisfy those cravings. Parents found themselves trading valuable possessions, blankets, tools, even family heirlooms, to agency employees who had access to extra sugar supplies. The white crystals became a form of currency more valuable than money, since money couldn't buy what wasn't for sale. But the cruelest innovation was mandatory haircutting. In Lakota culture, a man's hair represented his spiritual power and personal history. Warriors grew their hair long and decorated it with feathers and ornaments that told the story of their lives. Cutting hair was done only in mourning, a symbol of grief and loss. McLaughlin made hair cutting mandatory for all Lakota men, claiming it was necessary for hygiene and civilization. But everyone understood the real purpose, breaking the spiritual connection between Lakota people and their traditional identity. Men who submitted to the barber's shears were rewarded with extra rations. Those who refused found their families' food allocations reduced to starvation levels. The hair-cutting ceremonies became public humiliations designed to break resistance through shame. Men were forced to sit on wooden chairs in the agency courtyard, while government barbers shaved off decades of spiritual growth. Women and children were required to watch, creating psychological trauma that extended throughout the community. Some warriors wept openly as their hair fell to the ground. Others sat in stoic silence, but observers noted that their spirits seemed to die with each snip of the scissors. Touch the clouds. The 7-foot giant, who had once been one of the most feared war leaders on the plains, was among those forced to submit. Witnesses described how he sat motionless for nearly an hour while the barber worked, his massive frame shaking with suppressed rage. When the cutting was finished, he looked like a different person, not just physically, but spiritually diminished. Children who saw him afterward reportedly burst into tears, unable to recognize the man who had once seemed larger than life. The ban on the sun dance in 1883 struck at the heart of Lakota spirituality. The sun dance wasn't just a ceremony. It was the central religious observance that connected the Lakota to their sacred universe. Young men proved their courage by dancing for days without food or water, some piercing their chests and hanging from buffalo skulls as offerings to the spirits. The ceremony renewed the sacred relationship between the people and the natural world that sustained them. But Agent McLaughlin declared the sun dance a barbaric practice that had no place in civilized society. Indian police were instructed to arrest anyone who participated in the ceremony, or even possessed the sacred objects used in the ritual. Medicine men who had conducted sun dances for decades were thrown into agency jails, their sacred pipes and eagle feathers confiscated and destroyed. The prohibition created a spiritual crisis that shattered traditional Lakota society. Without the sun dance, young men had no way to prove their courage or establish their place in the community. Elders who possessed sacred knowledge had no opportunity to pass it on to the next generation. The entire ritual calendar that had organized Lakota life for centuries was eliminated, leaving families adrift in a world without spiritual anchor. Some families tried to practice traditional ceremonies in secret, gathering in remote locations away from agency supervision. But the Indian police had informants throughout the reservation, and secret ceremonies often ended in mass arrests. Families who were caught practicing traditional religion faced severe punishments, reduced rations, imprisonment, and separation of children from parents. The replacement religion was Christianity, but not the gentle Christianity of love and forgiveness. This was a harsh Protestantism that demanded total rejection of traditional beliefs and practices. Lakota families were required to attend church services every Sunday, where missionaries preached that their ancestors were burning in hell for following false gods. Children were taught that traditional stories were lies invented by the devil to lead people astray. The psychological impact was devastating. Many Lakota adults suffered what we would now recognize as severe depression, unable to reconcile the spiritual world they had known with the alien religion being forced upon them. Some turned to alcohol, which was readily available despite government prohibitions. Others simply withdrew into themselves, sitting in silence while their world crumbled around them. But perhaps the most destructive innovation was the boarding school system. Richard Henry Pratt's Carlisle Indian School, opening in 1879, became the model for institutions designed to eliminate tribal identity through education. Pratt's motto was, "Kill the Indian and save the man," a philosophy that perfectly captured the genocidal intent behind the civilizing mission. Children as young as 5 were taken from their families and shipped to schools hundreds of miles away. At Carlisle and similar institutions, everything familiar was stripped away. Indian names were replaced with European ones. Tatanka Yotake became John Smith, Winona became Mary Johnson. Traditional clothing was burned and replaced with military-style uniforms. Native languages were forbidden, with students beaten severely for speaking even a word of Lakota. The daily routine was designed to break any connection to tribal culture. Students rose at dawn to the sound of bugles, ate breakfast consisting of coffee, white bread and sugar-sweetened oatmeal, then spent the day in classes that taught them to despise everything their parents valued. They learned that Indians were savage and backward, that white civilization was superior in every way, and that their only hope for success lay in complete assimilation. At mealtimes, children who had grown up eating buffalo meat and wild vegetables were forced to consume an alien diet that made many of them physically ill. The coffee was particularly traumatic for young children who had never tasted anything so bitter. But students who refused to drink it were punished severely, and eventually most developed a tolerance that gradually became dependence. The sugar served with every meal created immediate addiction. Children who had known sweetness only from occasional wild berries now consumed refined sugar 3 times a day. Within months, many were experiencing the mood swings and energy crashes that accompany sugar dependency. Teachers noted that students became increasingly difficult to control when sweet foods were withheld, leading to a system where good behavior was rewarded with extra dessert. But the psychological damage went far deeper than dietary changes. Children who had been raised to respect elders and value community cooperation were now taught to compete against each other for individual advancement. Students were encouraged to inform on classmates who violated school rules, creating an atmosphere of suspicion and betrayal that destroyed traditional bonds of kinship and loyalty. The most successful students were those who completely rejected their tribal identity, adopting white names, white customs, and white attitudes toward their own people. These graduates were often sent back to reservations as teachers and administrators, where they became agents of their own people's cultural destruction. They spoke English perfectly but had forgotten Lakota. They could recite Shakespeare but had never heard traditional stories. They knew how to use European table manners but couldn't perform basic tasks like tanning hides or preparing traditional foods. When these educated Indians returned home, they found themselves caught between 2 worlds, accepted by neither. Their families viewed them as strangers who had abandoned their people. White society saw them as Indians trying to rise above their station. Many suffered severe psychological problems, turning to alcohol or falling into deep depressions that sometimes ended in suicide. Meanwhile, the reservation system was undergoing its own transformation through the Dawes Act of 1887. This legislation shattered the remaining tribal land base by dividing communal property into individual homesteads. The stated goal was to teach Indians the value of private property and individual initiative. The real result was the loss of millions of acres of tribal land. Under the Dawes Act, the Great Sioux Reservation was carved up like a pie, with individual Lakota families receiving 160-acre plots that they were supposed to farm like white homesteaders. The remaining land, millions of acres that had been guaranteed to the Lakota, forever was declared surplus and opened to white settlement. The allotment process was a bureaucratic nightmare that took years to complete. Families who had lived together for generations found themselves assigned to plots miles apart. Traditional leaders who had made decisions through consensus were replaced by government-appointed administrators who understood nothing about Lakota culture. The entire social structure that had sustained the Lakota for centuries was systematically dismantled and replaced with a European model that made no sense in the context of Plains Indian life. Most Lakota had no experience with farming and no interest in learning. They had been buffalo hunters and horse warriors, not crop-growing peasants. The government provided minimal training and inadequate tools, then blamed the Indians when crops failed and families went hungry. Many families leased their allotments to white farmers for cash that was quickly spent on commodity foods and trade goods, creating a cycle of dependency that would last for generations. The coffee and sugar rations that had once been distributed by agents now had to be purchased with money earned from leasing land or selling possessions. Families who had once controlled vast hunting grounds were reduced to counting pennies to buy basic necessities. Children who had grown up expecting abundance now learned the bitter lesson of scarcity, watching parents trade away family heirlooms for a few pounds of coffee or a small bag of sugar. But perhaps the most tragic transformation was in the way Lakota people viewed themselves. A culture that had valued generosity above wealth now emphasized individual accumulation. A society that had measured success by the number of horses a man could give away now measured it by the amount of commodity foods a family could hoard. The traditional Lakota practice of sharing resources with anyone in need was gradually replaced by a European model of nuclear family responsibility. Chiefs, who had once led through example and moral authority, now derived their power from government appointment and control of ration distribution. Red Cloud, the great war leader who had forced the United States to abandon its forts, was reduced to begging agents for extra coffee supplies to distribute to his followers. The man who had negotiated as an equal with American generals now petitioned like a supplicant for permission to visit other reservations. Young Lakota, who had never known the buffalo hunting days, grew up thinking that dependency was normal, that standing in line for government handouts was simply how life worked. They developed tastes for foods their ancestors had never eaten, and cravings for substances their great-grandparents had never encountered. Coffee became as essential to daily life as water. Sugar became more valuable than silver. And gradually, these dietary dependencies created psychological dependencies that made resistance to government control almost impossible. The traditional Lakota kinship system, which had extended obligations and privileges throughout the entire tribe, was gradually replaced by European concepts of nuclear family responsibility. Children who had once been raised by the entire community were now the exclusive responsibility of individual parents. Elders who had once been revered sources of wisdom were increasingly viewed as burdens who consumed resources without contributing to family. In Gum, the language itself began changing as English words crept into daily conversation. Lakota families found themselves using English terms for new foods, new concepts, new relationships that had no equivalent in their traditional language. Coffee became cape in Lakota pronunciation. Sugar became chanhanpiska, literally white tree sap. But gradually, even these Lakota terms were replaced by English words as children became more comfortable with the language of their oppressors than the language of their ancestors. By 1890, the transformation was nearly complete. The Lakota people, who had once controlled territory larger than many European nations, were now confined to scattered reservations where every aspect of their lives was regulated by government agents. The buffalo herds that had sustained them for thousands of years were extinct. The horses that had made them the finest cavalry in the world were gone. The spiritual practices that had connected them to the sacred universe were forbidden. What remained was a people caught between two worlds, no longer truly Lakota, but not yet truly American. They drank coffee every morning and ate sugar with every meal, but these alien foods reminded them daily of their dependence on a government that had destroyed everything they once held sacred. They spoke English to their children but dreamed in Lakota of a world that would never return. The prisons of body and spirit were complete. But deep within those prisons, something indestructible was waiting, a spark of resistance that would eventually grow into new forms of survival and ultimately new forms of sovereignty. The sacred hoop was bent, but it was not broken. And in the darkest hour, when all seemed lost, that spark would kindle into flame. 1889 brought something the Lakota hadn't felt in decades: hope. It came from an unlikely source, a Nevada Paiute prophet named Wovoka, who claimed to have died and returned from the spirit world with a message that would transform the lives of desperate people across the American West. The message was simple and intoxicating: perform the ghost dance, and the white men would disappear. The buffalo would return. The dead would rise. The world would be made new again, restored to the way it had been before the coming of the whites. For people who had lost everything, their land, their children, their very identity, this wasn't just prophecy. This was the answer to prayers they barely dared to whisper. But to understand why the ghost dance spread like prairie fire across the reservations, you need to understand just how desperate conditions had become. The government had cut Indian rations by 20% in 1889, claiming budget constraints while spending millions on Civil War pensions for white veterans. Families who were already malnourished now faced actual starvation. Children were dying of diseases that well-fed people could easily survive. And winter was coming. The coffee rations, which had become as essential as bread to reservation families, were reduced to barely a tablespoon per person per day. The bitter liquid that had once been a morning comfort was now a precious luxury that mothers rationed like medicine. Some families tried to stretch their coffee by mixing the grounds with roasted corn or dried roots, creating a brew that satisfied caffeine cravings while providing almost no nutrition. Sugar, which had become the one reliable pleasure in otherwise miserable lives, was cut to a few teaspoons per week per family. Children who had grown accustomed to sweetening their government-issued oatmeal with generous spoonfuls of white crystals now fought over single grains that fell from the measuring spoon. Parents watched helplessly as their children developed the hollow-eyed look of chronic malnutrition, their bodies craving substances their grandparents had never tasted. It was into this desperation that news of Wovoka's vision arrived in the autumn of 1889. The prophet claimed that during a solar eclipse he had been taken up to heaven, where he met Jesus Christ himself. Christ told him that the Indians had suffered enough, that salvation was coming, and that those who performed the sacred dance would be reunited with their ancestors in a world where whites had never existed. The message reached the Lakota reservations through a complex network of intertribal communication that had survived decades of government attempts to isolate different tribes from each other. Runners carried the news from reservation to reservation, trading posts to trading posts, until even the most remote Lakota communities had heard about the Paiute prophet and his miraculous vision. But it was the specific details of Wovoka's prophecy that made it so compelling to the Lakota. The new world he described wasn't just a return to the old ways, it was a perfected version of the old ways. The buffalo herds would be larger than ever before. The grass would be greener, the water cleaner, the hunting grounds more abundant. And best of all, there would be no more death, no more disease, no more suffering. Short Bull and Kicking Bear, two Lakota holy men, traveled all the way to Nevada to meet Wovoka personally and learn the sacred dance. When they returned in the spring of 1890, they brought modifications that made the ghost dance specifically relevant to Plains Indian culture. They added militant elements that Wovoka himself had never taught, creating ghost shirts that they claimed would make warriors bulletproof against white weapons. The ghost shirts became the most visible symbol of the movement. Made from white muslin decorated with sacred symbols, eagles, buffalo, stars, and moons, they were supposed to protect the wearer from all harm. Warriors who had been reduced to begging for government rations suddenly found themselves preparing for a final battle that would end with the restoration of their world. But here's what made the ghost dance so dangerous. From the government's perspective, it was creating unity among people who had been systematically divided and demoralized. Lakota from different reservations began visiting each other to learn the dance and share visions. Traditional enemies like the Lakota and Pawnee started communicating about their shared suffering under white rule. The movement was becoming a pan-Indian resistance that threatened the entire reservation system. The dance itself was unlike anything in traditional Plains Indian culture. Participants formed large circles, holding hands and shuffling slowly to the left, while singing songs that Wovoka claimed had been taught to him by the spirits. The dancing continued for hours, sometimes days, until dancers collapsed in exhaustion and experienced visions of the coming new world. These visions were remarkably consistent across different tribes and reservations. Dancers saw vast herds of buffalo covering the plains. They spoke with deceased relatives who appeared young and healthy, free from the diseases and injuries that had killed them. They witnessed the earth opening up to swallow white settlements while leaving Indian camps untouched. And they returned from these visions with absolute certainty that salvation was coming. The psychological impact was profound. People who had been ground down by decades of systematic oppression suddenly had something to live for. Children who had been taught to hate their Indian identity now took pride in participating in an ancient-seeming ceremony. Elders who had watched their culture being destroyed piece by piece suddenly found young people eager to learn traditional songs and stories. But the movement also created dangerous delusions. Warriors began talking openly about the coming war that would drive out the whites. Some ghost dance leaders predicted specific dates when the transformation would occur. First, the spring of 1891, then the summer, then the autumn. When these dates passed without the promised changes, some believers became even more fervent, convinced that they needed to demonstrate greater faith or perform the ceremony more perfectly. The government response was swift and harsh. Agent James McLaughlin at Standing Rock immediately banned the ghost dance, declaring it a threat to peace and order. He ordered the Indian police to arrest anyone caught participating in the ceremony or even possessing ghost dance paraphernalia. Similar prohibitions were announced at Pine Ridge, Rosebud, and other Lakota agencies, but the prohibition only drove the movement underground and made it more radical. Secret gatherings in remote locations became planning sessions for armed resistance. Warriors who had been peaceful for decades began acquiring weapons and ammunition. The ghost shirts, originally designed for spiritual protection, became uniforms for what some believers thought would be the final war against white oppression. The situation became critical when Sitting Bull, now in his late 50s and living quietly at Standing Rock, allowed ghost dancing in his camp. This wasn't because the old war leader believed in Wovoka's prophecy. Sitting Bull was too experienced and too realistic to think that dancing could bring back the buffalo. But he understood that his people needed hope, and if the ghost dance provided that hope, he wouldn't forbid it. McLaughlin saw Sitting Bull's tolerance of the movement as proof that the old chief was planning a rebellion. In McLaughlin's mind, Sitting Bull remained the most dangerous Indian in America, a symbol of resistance that could inspire others to violence. The agent began pressing Washington for permission to arrest the famous war leader, claiming that Sitting Bull was the real power behind the ghost dance movement. The crisis escalated throughout the autumn of 1890. Hundreds of ghost dancers gathered at Pine Ridge Agency, performing the ceremony openly, despite government prohibitions. Agent Daniel Royer, who had only recently been appointed and had no experience with Indian affairs, panicked and telegraphed Washington that he was facing an imminent uprising. His hysterical reports, combined with McLaughlin's warnings about Sitting Bull, convinced officials that military intervention was necessary. On November 20th, 1890, troops began arriving at the Lakota agencies. The 7th Cavalry, Custer's old regiment reconstituted after the Little Bighorn disaster, was among the units deployed. For many Lakota, the sight of soldiers wearing the same uniforms as the men they had killed 14 years earlier was deeply provocative. Some ghost dance believers saw the military build-up as confirmation that the final battle was approaching. The presence of troops created a volatile situation that could explode into violence at any moment. Ghost dancers became more militant, convinced that they needed to defend their religious freedom. Government officials became more paranoid, interpreting every gathering as evidence of planned rebellion. And ordinary Lakota families found themselves caught in the middle, unsure whether to flee to the safety of the agencies or remain in their homes and risk being caught up in whatever violence might come. December 15th, 1890 became the day that hope died. That morning, Indian police surrounded Sitting Bull's cabin at dawn, with orders to arrest the old chief and bring him to the agency. McLaughlin had convinced his superiors that Sitting Bull was planning to flee to the Badlands and join the militant ghost dancers. Though there was no evidence to support this claim, the arrest went wrong from the beginning. Sitting Bull, awakened from sleep, protested that he had done nothing wrong and demanded to know why he was being arrested. His followers gathered outside the cabin, angry that their leader was being taken away by Indian police, their own people serving the government that had destroyed their way of life. In the crowd was Sitting Bull's 14-year-old son, Crowfoot, a boy caught between two worlds like so many reservation children. He had learned English in government school, but still spoke Lakota at home. He drank coffee every morning like a white child, but listened to traditional stories every evening. And on this December morning, he watched as tribal police prepared to take away his father. The exact sequence of events remains disputed, but witnesses agree that someone in the crowd fired a shot. Within seconds, the situation exploded into a gunfight that left 8 people dead, including Sitting Bull and his young son. The great war leader who had defeated Custer, who had lived in exile rather than surrender, who had become a symbol of resistance to an entire generation of Indians, died in a struggle with his own people outside his own home. News of Sitting Bull's death spread across the reservations like wildfire, creating panic among ghost dancers who realized that the government was prepared to use deadly force to stop their movement. Many families fled to the Badlands, hoping to find safety in the remote canyons and broken country where soldiers would have difficulty following. Others tried to reach Pine Ridge Agency, where they hoped to surrender peacefully and avoid the violence that seemed to be spreading. Among those trying to reach safety was Chief Bigfoot and his band of Mini-Conjou Lakota. Bigfoot was elderly and sick with pneumonia, hardly the dangerous war leader that some officials claimed he was. His people were mostly women, children, and elderly men, not the army of militants that newspapers were describing. But they were ghost dancers, and that made them targets in the hysteria that followed Sitting Bull's death. On December 28th, Major Samuel Whitside intercepted Bigfoot's band near Wounded Knee Creek and ordered them to make camp while he decided what to do with them. The major was nervous. He had nearly 400 Indians under his control, including some warriors who might be armed. But Bigfoot's people were exhausted, hungry, and frightened. They had been traveling for days in bitter cold, and their leader was so sick he could barely sit upright. That evening, the soldiers distributed rations to the hungry Indians, coffee, hardtack, and a few strips of bacon. For many of the children, this was the first substantial meal they had eaten in days. The coffee, brewed strong and sweetened with a little precious sugar from the soldiers' supplies, provided both warmth and comfort on a night when the temperature dropped well below freezing. Families huddled around small fires, sharing the meager rations and trying to stay warm. Children who had grown up hearing stories about the great victories of their parents and grandparents now faced an uncertain future as prisoners of the same army their ancestors had defeated. Some had ghost shirts hidden under their clothes, still believing that the sacred garments would protect them from harm. Colonel James Forsyth arrived with reinforcements that night, bringing the total military force to nearly 500 men. 4 Hotchkiss guns, rapid-fire cannons capable of devastating effect, were positioned on a hill overlooking the Indian camp. The official mission was to disarm Bigfoot's band and escort them to the agency. But the massive show of force suggested that some officers were hoping for a fight. The morning of December 29th dawned clear and cold. Soldiers surrounded the Indian camp at dawn and ordered all the men to assemble for a weapons search. Bigfoot, so sick with pneumonia that he had to be carried on a stretcher, was placed in the center of the gathering where everyone could see him. The message was clear. Even their chief was helpless. The weapons search began peacefully enough. Most of the warriors surrendered their rifles without resistance, understanding that they were outnumbered and surrounded. But the soldiers weren't satisfied with the small number of guns they collected. They began searching teepees and personal belongings, looking for hidden weapons and growing more aggressive when they didn't find the arsenal they expected. The confrontation escalated when soldiers tried to search a young warrior named Black Coyote, who was deaf and didn't understand the shouted commands to surrender his rifle. Other Indians tried to explain that he couldn't hear, but the soldiers interpreted their gestures as threatening behavior. In the struggle that followed, Black Coyote's rifle discharged, whether accidentally or intentionally, no one will ever know. That single shot triggered a massacre that would haunt American history. The Hotchkiss guns opened fire from the hill, raking the Indian camp with explosive shells. Soldiers with rifles shot at anything that moved. Men, women, children, even babies in their mothers' arms. The systematic slaughter continued for hours, with troops pursuing fleeing families for miles across the frozen prairie. When the killing finally stopped, nearly 300 Lakota lay dead in the snow. Among them were women who had been shot while running away, children who had been killed while hiding in ravines, and elderly people who had been too weak to flee. Bigfoot's body was found frozen in a grotesque position, his arms raised as if trying to ward off the bullets that killed him. But perhaps the most tragic victims were the children who had been fed coffee and hardtack by the soldiers just hours before being shot down like animals. Some were found still clutching the tin cups they had used for their last meal, the bitter liquid frozen solid in the December cold. Others had pieces of hardtack in their pockets, saved for later, because they had learned that food was precious and should never be wasted. A blizzard struck that night, covering the bodies with snow and making rescue impossible for 3 days. When burial parties finally arrived, they found a scene that shocked even frontier-hardened soldiers. Families had died together, parents using their bodies to shield children who died anyway. Babies were found frozen solid in their mothers' arms, and scattered throughout the killing field were the pathetic remnants of the ghost dance movement. Torn pieces of ghost shirts that had failed to provide protection, eagle feathers trampled in the bloody snow, and sacred items that had been desecrated by the violence. The soldiers collected the bodies like cordwood and dumped them in a mass grave, charging the government $2 per corpse for the burial service. Among the dead lay infants who had been nursing when the shooting started, their last taste of life, the sweetened coffee their mothers had been given by the same soldiers who killed them. Children who had been taught to crave sugar now lay, frozen, with their forever empty mouths open to the winter sky. 20. Soldiers received medals of honor for their actions at Wounded Knee, the same decoration, given to heroes who saved lives rather than took them. The official reports described a battle against hostile warriors, but survivors told a different story. This hadn't been a battle. This had been the systematic murder of people whose only crime was believing that their suffering would end. The massacre marked the official end of the Indian Wars, but it also marked the end of something more fundamental, the death of hope itself. The ghost dance movement died in the snow at Wounded Knee, along with the dreams of people who had dared to believe that their prayers might be answered. The buffalo were gone forever. The dead would not rise, and the white men would not disappear. What remained was a people broken in body and spirit, dependent on government rations for survival and government permission for everything else. The coffee and sugar that had once been exotic trade goods were now necessities as essential as air and water. Children who should have been learning to hunt buffalo were instead learning to stand in line for handouts. And gradually, inexorably, the very act of survival was transforming the Lakota into something their ancestors wouldn't recognize. The frontier was officially closed. The Indian Wars were over, and in government boarding schools across the country, Lakota children were learning to prefer white bread and sugar to traditional foods, English words to their ancestral language, and Christian prayers to the songs their grandparents had sung to the spirits. The sacred hoop was bent nearly to breaking, but not quite broken. In the ashes of Wounded Knee, something indestructible was already stirring. A new kind of resistance that would use the white man's own tools against him. The next generation of warriors would fight with law degrees instead of war lances, with political organizations instead of war parties, and with an understanding that true sovereignty meant mastering the systems that had conquered them. But that is another story for another time. The story of the Lakota Golden Age ends here, in the snow of Wounded Knee, where dreams froze solid and a people learned that survival itself was a form of victory, however bitter the taste.